people still showing up. But I guess we can get started. I'm very pleased to welcome Rhyd, someone that I've known for some years now, and whose work I've respected a great deal. A few words of introduction. Rhyd Wildermuth is a druid, an author, and a theorist of polytheism, politics, and the sacred. He's the co-founder and director of Ritona ASBL, a not-for-profit publishing and educational association advocating for pluralism, tolerance, and respect for pagan, indigenous, and non-industrial ways of being in the world. A prolific essayist and author, Rhyd has written 8 books, including Being Pagan, A Guide to Re-Enchant Your Life, which in fact I have right here, and the forthcoming Here Be Monsters, How to Fight Capitalism Instead of Each Other. That sounds like a good idea. He's spoken at many events on the topics of animism, polytheism, and the pagan resurgence, including, I would say, the one at which we first met in 2014, the Polytheist Leadership Conference. He's a polytheist and a druid, and his practices are rooted deeply in the land where he lives, the Arduena Silva, the forests of Arduina. His beliefs are also informed by the gods and people of other lands where he has lived, as well as a desire to unveil the profound magical practices continuing in everyday life. And now, let me say this. Having been a pagan myself for a long time now, my entire adult life, it's extraordinarily difficult, even though it's something, and I think that many people who share this path would agree, something that comes very naturally for us, but extremely difficult to talk about and to characterize in the kind of terms that we're accustomed to talking about religious membership, religious identification, And I thought that something that you wrote in Being Pagan particularly spoke to this. You said, I do not present pagan as a religion to be part of or an identity to take on, but rather an active state of being itself. Put another way, pagan is not something you can be or become part of, but rather something you are actively being. The crucial point here is active relation to the world. Being pagan is a manner of relating to ourselves and the world of which we are part, rather than a fixed set of beliefs, doctrines, practices, or identity traits. This kind of active relation to the world does have certain characteristics, however. For instance, it is ultimately animist, recognizing that humans are not the only persons on the earth, but rather in constant relation to other persons, the vast majority of which are not human. For an animist, everything is being and nothing is inanimate. A tree is not a mere material object or source of wood. It is a being just as we are beings. Similarly, a forest is not merely a large amount of trees all living in the same geographical area, but rather also a being in itself, composed of many beings, the way that a family is composed of many humans. Thus, being pagan also means being animist. But I do not title this book Being Animist for a very specific reason. Animist peoples are often associated in the modern mind, often because of the work of rather irresponsible authors, exclusively with indigeneity. This book is not a guide to being indigenous, since the vast majority of its readers are likely not living in the places even their parents lived in, let alone more ancient ancestors. Also, though pagan, animist, and indigenous beliefs and practices are often similar, they're not synonyms for each other. Now, what occurs to me in relation to this, a couple of things. First of all, there's the primacy of relation. Because as you say, this is a path that's about relation to non-human persons. That's one thing. The other thing is this problematic relationship to tradition. Because to be pagan, in the sense in which we mean it, is inherently to be engaged somehow with a tradition which by definition has been sundered or broken in some fashion. It's a kind of a relation in that sense, both to certain beings, but also to something which was and has been broken off, interrupted. And both of these elements are constitutive for it. And so I was just wondering if, to begin, you could speak a little bit to this kind of duality between a religious way of being in the world, which is both engaged with tradition and yet engaged with a tradition which is by definition somehow broken, and a relation to certain beings across a certain gulf.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the really nice reading, and thank you, INDICA, for hosting this. Edward, I think maybe you should do my audiobook. I like your reading voice. So with the question of the sundering of pagan traditions, one of the difficulties we have is in Western secular modernity, as it were. There's lots of other ways of calling it. When we look at the idea of a living tradition or of a tradition, we always think of it as being linear, just like we think of everything else in the West as being linear. Time is linear.
Rhyd, can I request you to speak a little louder, please?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Can you hear me a bit better now?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine, but yeah, it's always good, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I'll definitely talk louder. Okay. So I was saying we have this idea of linear time, which is also linear tradition and linear life, and this idea of progress of humans going from more primitive or basic or more simple ways of being into something more complex, with the idea of that being bigger. But one of the difficulties we have when we're looking at the idea of tradition and continuity from a Western perspective is that we forget that the sources or the actual living beings that are also involved in that tradition, because it's not just humans, of course, still exist. The idea is that oftentimes when you see religious scholars or historians talk about it, they say, well, these traditions are over, and that's it. They just look at the human aspect of no one at this time is currently going to these shrines, to these temples, keeping these festivals. But if, within this perspective, the spirits, the gods, all of these beings still exist. They don't stop existing just because there's no historical record of humans at this time talking to them. So that's, I think, the difficulty there. And that's where you kind of put tradition and relationship back together. In other religions, this is quite obvious, where the idea of a god or a singular god or whatever always existing. There's never a question for people whether or not those traditions are sundered. It's mostly, okay, let's try to reset them. But for paganism, for the wider idea of polytheism all throughout the world, if the beings that the animists and the polytheists are recognizing still exist, which of course, if they don't exist, we'd have to ask why. But if they're still existing, then there's always a chance of relationship with it. Just to bring it something more human, more simple, you might not currently be in relation with your family, but as long as your family is still existing, there's always a possibility of re-engaging in that relationship. Whether you want to or you don't want to, is up to personal choice. But as long as there is family, you can still do that. And then on a wider perspective, with ancestral recognition, if your ancestors, I mean, they're dead, but that doesn't mean they disappear. So there's always a chance of reinitiating or picking up these practices again. Friendship is the same way. You might not talk to a friend for a very long time. That does not necessarily mean that they are no longer there. And if they're still living, which we believe that the gods are still living, there's always a chance to talk to them again. So I think that's the way I look at the question of tradition, or sundered traditions, as it were, in relationship. It's like, well, they're still there, so we can still relate to them.
Exactly. And I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that this is something that actually has significance for continuous traditions as well, because the perspective that says basically that if some tradition is cut off at some point through whatever kinds of contingent historical factors, then if it were to be picked up again, it would be somehow inauthentic, or in some way it wouldn't even exist. This is a way of looking at religious practice, which is fundamentally human-centric. It basically says that what constitutes a religion are just certain patterns of human activity. And the continuity of those patterns of activity is literally all that there is to the religion itself. And the aspect of relation, the aspect of being in relationship to someone, or to diverse someone's, drops out. And this affects even continuous traditions, because if they should change over time, then the notion, if we adopt this kind of human-centric perspective, is, well, how do we even know that it's the same tradition? You can never step in the same river twice, kind of thing. This notion of what constitutes the religious way of being, whether it's relation to something or whether it's just things we do. I think that it impinges on religions that are continuous just as much as ones that are that are being revived after having been cut off in some way. Even though I think that those of us engaged in reviving certain kinds of traditions, reviving certain relationships, I'd prefer to say.
If I could suggest,
yeah.
Can I suggest something? So this is a larger question besides just religion. There's the writer, interestingly, a Catholic writer, G.K. Chesterton, who, in his book Orthodoxy, he describes the difficulty of using scientific knowledge or using that scientific framework to prove that love exists or that ghosts exist. He uses a funny statement where he says, well, the problem with ghosts is they tend to not really like to sit around in laboratories. But at the same time, there's also how do you prove somebody loves each other? You can try to take two people who are in love into a laboratory and try to make them, show signs of what love is, but it still does not actually get to the core of what humans mean by love. The same thing happens with religion. When you look at the question of authenticity, what is authentic religion? Well, you can try as much as you like to use all of the Western academic paradigm and all of its tools to try to decide what is authentic and what is not. But again, you're talking about it from a laboratory perspective. It's always going to be reductive. It's always looking for specific signs of something, but those signs are being created by those who run the laboratories themselves. So, I think that it applies to all religions, regardless of, their particular paradigm. But you cannot prove authentic religious practices and belief because it's not even, it doesn't even fit within that human paradigm of what is provable and what is not. Instead, you have to say, well, this is happening, and then start from there. Like, people are having these profound relationships with these gods. People are having these profound ecstatic experiences in groups centered around, religious principles, religious ideas, groups of gods, singular god, what have you. You have to start from there and then ask questions and let that inform what you're trying to figure out. You start with that being the authentic experience, and then you ask what else is authentic.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if we think about it, I mean, if we think about what we actually do as pagans or revivalist polytheists or whatever, I mean, we may not do anything really exactly like what was done by people in some remote area of antiquity. And that's not necessarily our concern at all. Or if we are trying to do things that the ancients did, we're doing it on account of that relationship that we've established in whatever fashion, often in an absolutely peculiar and idiosyncratic fashion. We've established that relationship. It's come about somehow. And so if we're doing things that the ancients did, it's because we're trying to deepen and enrich that relationship in some way. But we may not be doing things very much at all like the way they did things. Now, I mean, conversely, we can see that, in the matrix of European folk Catholicism, for example, or in many of the folk practices in the Orthodox churches, we can see a lot of material continuities with pagan worship, pagan traditions. And, in some cases, we might say that there is a continuity of the relationship as well. It very well may be the case. And I know that this is a subject that interests you particularly. But then again, I mean, it may not be, because there are also people participating in those traditions who are quite self-consciously relating to a different God. And obviously we have to respect the difference of that relationship as well, and not reduce the entire the entire religion to simply these things that people do at just this particular time in just this particular way, without that vital aspect of relation being taken into account.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because otherwise people might just say, well, I mean, why not just be part of those traditions that have whatever degree of continuity they have in these practices? Because if we just put the value on that, then that would be what matters.
Yeah, I find oftentimes in situations like that, it's merely necessary to very slightly shift your perspective on the question of what those practices are. Again, the problem is the Western intellectual framework is always reductive. It always needs a one-to-one relationship. It always needs to say, this is the only thing that this means, except that humans don't work that way. You know, I think of the identity as a great way to look at this. You know, I am both a son and I am also a brother. I am two different things, but I am the same person. And those matter, or those come into play when you just slightly shift your perspective. You cannot say, I am only a son, or I am only a brother. And then I am many, many, many other things as well. So when we look at practices, you know, where I am currently living in the Ardennes, it's the land of the Celtic Treveri, and the Franks also later came in as well. Now, it has a peculiar history because it was very isolated from the rest of Western Europe. It was able to kind of maintain, it has its own language, for example. Luxembourgish is a very, very, very old form of German that was brought in from the Franks. It's closer, in fact, to Dutch than it is to German, but it actually isn't either of those languages. It has a different trajectory here, and if you look at the way that religious practices continued here, they also appear to be different, and they do preserve a lot of those very old continuations that came over with the earlier Franks, as opposed to the later ones who then, you know, settled into France. One example of that is a ritual called the Boersbrennen. It happens right around Inbolc, for those who know the pagan cycle. It's a burning ritual. It's if you look at it, it looks very close to Beltane fires as well. But you know, it preserves some very strange differences from other places in Europe that practice some sort of continuation to it. And of course, it's been renamed as a Christian ritual. It's a Catholic ritual, but it preceded the Catholics. People had been burning large amounts of woods against the winter to stop or to say goodbye to the winter, to welcome the light again. Now,
those who might not be familiar with the timing of the Wiccan Imbolc, that's early February or late January, generally speaking.
Yeah, and so when you go to these rituals, they're public events, and they're public events that have been going on for as long as anyone remembers. There's very little history written on as to when precisely they were renamed as part of the church calendar. But there's very little Jesus or God in these events, even though it's technically part of the church. There are other rituals like that as well, and some of them have even more blatant pagan continuations with them. But for material practice, which is something you had brought up, which I think is a very important thing for us to look at, because oftentimes we focus too heavily on belief and the realm of ideas and ideology to figure out what people actually believe, what these things actually meant to people. But you can look at the material culture as well, or the material continuations, and say, oh, well, this is something interesting. People have been coming to this place. My best example, I think, is a nearby tree. It is an extremely old oak. Oaks, particularly in the Ardennes, just as with the Celts and other places, were considered holy. Considered sacred, and they continue to be considered sacred after Christian conversion. And a lot of these extremely old oaks have shrines in front of them. Now, these shrines are new, and the shrines are often to the Virgin Mary. But the Virgin Mary, or the specific Virgin Mary, there are many Virgin Marys that appear there, are different from the virgins that you'll see inside of the church. Oftentimes they're, you know, Mary the thaumaturge, as it were, you know, the miracle work. And people go to these shrines to light candles, to give offerings to marry, as it were, for healing, for not for salvation, but for something very physical. Someone is sick, someone has cancer, someone is dying, for a difficult pregnancy, etc. Now, if you just look at the shrine in front of the oak, you miss something extremely important, which is that, while they might be kneeling in front of the shrine, if you step back just a couple of steps, you realize they are kneeling at the foot of an oak tree, just as other peoples who were here, the pagans, as it were, had also been doing. They had been giving offerings to oak trees too. So the offerings are still being made at the foot of oak trees. Now, there is an extra symbol on the door, an extra sign on the door saying, well, this is what these offerings now are for. But if you cannot see that sign, if you just walk on the side of the tree and look at what's happening, you still see someone is at the foot of an oak tree praying. That I think is extremely important, again, when we look at the idea of continuation, authenticity, and whether or not what polytheists are trying to do within the West, can be considered authentic. It's like, well, what does authentic mean? The woman at the foot of that oak, is it inauthentic that she's praying to the shrine, even though she's still doing exactly the same gestures, exactly the same act at the foot of the oak? There's just an extra sign there. Or are there multiple levels of complexity there? And I think that is extremely relevant and something I try very hard to focus on when I talk about paganism.
Well, yeah, and so, I mean, this goes to the question of what we might term a more animist materialism rather than a reductive materialism. A materialism where we see the material practices as being like a kind of a common ground, a kind of a meeting place. And you have many people who are participating in a common material activity with their different understandings, their different ideologies, being there with them, but being together in a common place. And I think that this is one of the things that, to speak about pagan or polytheist ideology, I think that one of the things that it brings to the table is this kind of more expansive relationship to materiality, so that it's not merely a tree, but it's also not merely the beliefs that different people bring to it, but it's rather the space where these things come together, the space where certain practices and certain intentions and deeply held values and beliefs come together. And in that way, we don't pit belief against practice anymore, or ideas against matter anymore, but rather we see them all as being in the common space of the world. I think that to speak a little bit more about how it is that people come to be reanimating these relationships, and the kinds of difficulties involved, because I think, a lot of the people who, at least a significant portion of the people who are going to be listening to this, will be coming from the point of view of a continuous tradition that has many similar practices, many similar kinds of relationships, as what we do. But because they're coming from continuous traditions, it may be very difficult for them to imagine how it is that people come from a lack of engagement with these things, an alienation or an estrangement from these aspects of a kind of deep tradition, to suddenly being engaged with them again. And some of the difficulties that are involved in having a relationship to gods in particular, which is idiosyncratic to say the least, and not mainstream within our culture, the kinds of peculiar, I think, boons and banes that it brings with it. The creativity that's involved and the immediacy and the spontaneity of the relationship, I think, being one of the boons. But the drawbacks also being the kind of self-doubt, the question of whether the sheer idiosyncrasy of the experience somehow invalidates it, and also because of the kind of mainstream society, the kind of default orientation that we're dealing with, a person doubts even their personal sanity. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this kind of push and pull a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. The beginning of my experiences that brought me into pagan polytheism would definitely, in most Western perspectives, be diagnosed. There's the people who have experiences that don't fit into the everyday idea of secular society will tend to feel a little crazy, and other people might think they're a little crazy. Were we in a society that had a robust and very, very widespread polytheist practice, or even just animist in general, then it would be very easy to just go ask someone, hey, this happened, and I'm not sure what this is, or I had these dreams and they were extremely profound and very worrying. Can you help me understand this? And there would have been priests or other elders there to actually say, oh, okay, I know what this is. Or, they might also have a question, I haven't seen something like this. So why don't you just hold on to that idea, but don't take that seriously yet. Don't run with it yet. But we don't have that. Instead, what we have are the secularized, disenchanted psychotherapists, some of which might say, actually, hey, this sounds like you're having an authentic religious experience. But oftentimes they might also say, you might be a little crazy. And so, first of all, having to fight that idea that you might be crazy, because that's also a possibility too. Especially with ecstatic religious experiences. The example I think of is Qigong illness. There's another word for it specifically, but within the practice of Qigong, there is a recognized problem that can occur when someone first begins that practice, where they get ideas of megalomania, or they start getting tremors that cannot stop. And this is something that Chinese medicine has recognized, because they understand that this is a profound spiritual practice that can sometimes make people go imbalanced, I guess is the kindest way to say it. But in other cases, it can cause them to be very destructive to themselves and to others. And usually it says, okay, hey, this has happened to you. You need to stop practicing. You should not practice any longer, because there's something inside of you that cannot handle these profound energies. We don't have anything like that in the West. So a lot of times we are trying to counsel ourselves, and that doesn't always go well. You see a lot of things that come across not just as ahistorical or nothing like tradition, but sometimes some pretty wild ideas that we have to gently and sometimes a little bit more harshly say, no, I don't think this is true. I think maybe you need to look away and perhaps get back into your body more and stop trying to have these really profound experiences. Were we, again, in a society that has a robust living tradition, we would not have to do these on our own. And at some point, I would hope that we don't have to do these on our own. That question, though, what the benefits are of this kind of reconstructive experiences is that it does come with a lot of creativity. It does come with, because there's not the weight of tradition behind it, we are able to come up with new ideas and apply a great passion to it, the same way that usually most early converts to anything have. There's always this rush of experience of, oh yes, I believe, or oh yes, this is happening, this is true, this is profound. So we still get to have that, and in fact, unfortunately, though, that's oftentimes all we have. Again, there are some really profound downsides to this that I think in a larger context, or to get past these initial moments of ecstasy, these initial moments of experiential belief, we need to start building something that can hold it. The word container comes to mind, but not to wall it off, not to gatekeep it, but to have enough people who have been doing this for a long time and can say, hey, I see something is happening that is really profound there. Let me help you. Let me show you what I've already learned. And then also at the same time, I will listen to your experiences and maybe find out some new things about the gods that I did not yet know.
Exactly. Some kind of container that's receptive, and this is what I think the difficulty, a person can try to create this kind of receptacle for themselves on their own just by being critical of their own practice, and also by, trying to establish for themselves a bit of a dialogue between some kind of continuity in what they've been doing themselves, at least, into which they can incorporate novelty and change, or ideally, we try to create a larger receptive community that could support people in these experiences, and not necessarily, as would be the case in a continuous tradition, where it would be someone's job, in all fairness, it would be someone's job to channel it to the degree possible, to channel these novel experiences to incorporate it into the existing tradition. Now, of course, one of the virtues of polytheist traditions is that they have a kind of a looser structure which can incorporate novelty more easily, which is one of the things that, has made polytheist civilizations extraordinarily resilient over long spans of time, because they can absorb novelty and somehow incorporate it in ways that both acknowledges its novelty and yet brings it into a supportive structure, integrates it into a supportive structure, so that you don't just have atomized individuals having experiences and struggling to incorporate them into their atomized lives, which brings us to the sort of problem in Western society in general, that we are all too often atomized individuals. And, we struggle to establish bonds of community that are healthy and not toxic to begin with, much less than trying to establish them in the absence of pre-existing large groups, large constituted structures
I think
instead often in tension with them.
yeah, I think part of our problem as well is that the only means of communication that we have right now is the internet. You don't have a lot of community meetings. You don't have a lot of community, as it were, and community and the internet are really the opposites. They, community requires some sort of physical presence, and there's no physical presence on the internet. So while you can still communicate with each other, you can still tell other people, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm learning. All of the other things that come along with physical, embodied religion are missing. So, I think of in India where you can have any number one of festivals. You join a festival with other people. Not necessarily every person believes precisely the same thing that you do when they're in that festival, but you have the actual physical experience of being amongst other people, other bodies besides your own body or yourself as body. And that is another core aspect of religion. You cannot, religion is not just in the head. In fact, it's better if the head is deprioritized a little bit. Religion, worship, reverence, belief are bodily experiences, not just mental experiences.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's people, someone from outside would listen to this. They would hear these kinds of difficulties that confront us, and it would seem to them insurmountable. They would think that the community would have to be established first, you see. And yet I think that there's a reason why we've been presented with this problem. If I could, be sort of, if I could be sort of providential about it, I mean, look at the peculiar position that we're in, because in a sense, this is the problem of establishing a community from the ground up. And it places us in a unique position, I think, to actually have to negotiate for ourselves this relationship, rather than having it given to us, rather than having it just presented to us as something that we would then have to negotiate our individuality in relation to. We would have to react to it and determine our difference from it and our degree of harmony with it. Instead, we're in the opposite position. We have to, from these unique and intensely idiosyncratic and even ineffable experiences, attempt to form a way of living and attempt to form a community where we can support one another and can somehow create these bonds that support the relationship to inhuman persons, and also that help us to be human to one another. Obviously, we're in a position of being able to be critical of the practices of traditions in the past. We're in the position of being able to do things differently. But at the same time, we have to somehow find a way to be in continuity with those who have come before, because that's just part of being in the world and having some kind of location, not being adrift, not being alienated. Let me just see. I see that there's a question, and people can, if they like, people can submit questions, because we could we could open this up a little bit to some other people. I see that Kay has a question here. It's a little long. Let me see if I can kind of encapsulate it a bit. Well, she says, Tim Addy frames this issue of severance from a tradition, in terms of being inspired by the gods, ancient traditions, versus what many people do nowadays, a sort of scientific method applied to figuring out worship. And she references a footnote from an ancient fragmentary text, Damascus' Life of Isidore. Some of us pagans are steeped in ancient texts. It's not all this romantic kneeling at the base of trees. Some of us kneel at the base of fragmentary papyri. That mentions an interpretation. Let's see. He speaks of a situation where a divine icon was smashed by Christian iconoclasts and a relationship damaged. The locals had to rely only on human ingenuity to combat floods rather than divine protection and divinely guided human action. How much of this discussion of relationality and what's missing from the conversation and authenticity could be satisfied by more nuanced conversations about divine inspiration and engagement with the gods to be in rhythm with them again, so to speak. And so I think that what this speaks to is, already in late antiquity, people were dealing with a situation in which they were witnessing in real time the kind of breaking of tradition and the kind of breaking of these relationships as being public, and people being thrown back onto their own resources. And in this way, I sometimes think that modern pagans and polytheist revivalists are kind of in this prolonged moment of late antiquity. In a way, there's always this question of when did this revival begin? And in a way, we could say that it began already back then, when people were first being confronted with, for the first time, having to, for instance, take their relationship with their gods private, having to privatize that relationship. And I wonder if it doesn't speak to many other questions of interiority and a kind of a parceling off, of a private space, a separation from the community that begins, in a sense, with that kind of break and the kind of privatizing of religious worship and a religious identity that has to be kept private for the first time.
One of the things I love this question a lot. The question of the specific example that we're speaking of, a smashed icon, and you no longer have that physical relic of the god's blessing and the god's connection to you, and yet the god doesn't need that relic necessarily to even be connected to the people. And I think this is very helpful in many situations where it's like, okay, we don't have these things that we really needed, but what we think is needed is sometimes a mistake. Sometimes it turns out you actually did not need that thing, or perhaps we're even relying too much on that. That can come into play when people are looking for the exact specific rituals that were occurring in order to venerate a god on a certain holy day.
Right.
If you're relying on needing those specific rituals and you cannot even try to do something without finding that specific recipe, you are focusing too much on, well, on the material, as it were. That you tend to forget in those situations that, well, if gods are living beings, then not having a specific item or specific recipe for that doesn't mean that that god is therefore going to disappear. Sometimes I think that that helps us take us away from the human-centric idea of what gods, spirits, and all of that are. We whirled them into the earth, but they exist for their own selves as well. The large oak tree in my behind my house is sacred, and it's not just sacred because it's sacred to me. It's sacred because it is itself. And remembering that, I think, helps us have a wider and I want to say a kinder perspective on human and divine inspiration, and that relationship. We tend to be very, very hard on ourselves, needing a specific, and again, I think that's a product of the Western secular mindset. That's, we've inherited that. We try to punish and discipline ourselves for not doing things exactly correct. Yeah. And the question is like, well,
we're very hard on ourselves and very hard on one another in this community.
Oh, of course. But I think that's a much more widespread problem than just with us.
Certainly. I mean, let's see. I think that, one question that I'd like to get to briefly before we're out of time or running over time is a question, and I mean, this is where a lot of, I think, some of the uncharitability within the community can come into play sometimes. And something that you've written about very perceptively is this entire problem of cultural appropriation. Because, as people who are engaged with broken traditions, often we're reaching out to other traditions in some ways, you could say, to patch the tears in that fabric. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to some of the ethics around this issue of cultural appropriation. And, also just, candidly, a little bit about, your feelings about how we can have a responsible and a respectful relationship to traditions that, we're not part of or that we're related to in a marginal way, let's say.
Sure, yeah. So I've written quite a bit on this and specifically wrote an essay that was also included in my book called A Plague of Gods on the question of cultural appropriation. Part of the problem is we, again, treat these religious and cultural forms as if they are static, as if they are unmoving, in essence, as if they are dead. A little bit of Marxism is really helpful for looking at this. We treat them as dead labor, dead commodities, that it's just a product. And what is happening is that on one side, people feel that they can shop for culture, as if there is a supermarket of culture and you can just select what you want off of the shelves. But on the other hand, we forget that those cultures, those practices exist for themselves and have a tendency, gods particularly, have always had a tendency of wanting to jump boundaries. It's very difficult to keep a god in one place. So that you find relics of worship of Isis and Diana in I'm sorry, that were both like very prevalent in Rome, but then you also find that in England. And the question is, were the English at that time cultural appropriating? No. They weren't. They were actually in an inferior political situation at that moment. But then you ask, well, were the Romans appropriating those gods, and should they have just left those gods where they were? But that misses the question, completely ignores the matter of, well, if you believe Isis and Diana are actually existing beings, then you can ask a question, well, why did they travel there too?
That's right.
And I think we miss that when we talk about cultural appropriation. We miss that very oftentimes these things that we try to keep static so we can understand them, they jump, they move, they spread. It's just like humans, we spread, we intermarry, our ideas go everywhere. Now, sometimes those ideas can become extremely hegemonic, but it requires a political power to be saying, no, this is what everyone needs to believe now. But in this case, we're not talking about political powers trying to enforce these ideas. Instead, we're talking about the other direction, or saying, well, why are there people who are venerating African gods in places that are not Africa? What's happening? Is that people stealing? Or is that also those African gods saying, hey, I'm coming here too?
Right.
When
The element
you
of
look
the
at that,
agency of the gods themselves.
yeah, that's very often missed. And what happens is, and I've mentioned this before, there's in the United States particularly, for a very long time, there was an idea, a hatred of any cultural mixing. Now, this was coming specifically from white nationalists, white supremacists, and Christian supremacists who, if they saw that their white children were wearing dreadlocks, they would be incredibly angry. But now especially in the United States, we have arguments saying, well, wait, no, those white people are wearing dreadlocks. They should not be doing that. That's cultural appropriation. But that's coming from a supposedly opposite political perspective. Yet it's still the same thing. It's still the people attempting to keep cultural forms static, keep them from jumping their boundaries. But again, cultural forms and the beings behind some of those cultural forms and gods themselves aren't really good at staying within human boundaries. And I think that is the perspective that is often missed. And without having that perspective, you cannot begin to have a discussion on what is abusive appropriation and what is just merely natural spread of customs, cultures, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I think an interesting thing in your analysis there is that, you recognize that a common desire to maintain a kind of a static social disposition, is coded, was coded previously on the right, and comes to be coded on the left, and yet it's a continuity of a kind of a disposition. In a way, it's like a negative example of the continuity of the veneration of the oak tree, in a sense. We can pull ourselves a little bit away from the ideological coding of things and think about a basic disposition, is, in this case, is culture something fluid that we expect to change, that we expect to hybridize, that we expect to mutate and transform, or is it something rigid that is going to demand of us a kind of a rigid adherence above all else? And I think that this is a really interesting level of the analysis there. And I think that, just by introducing the idea of the agency of inhuman entities, I think that we begin to change our whole understanding of what culture is. Because
I think too, that gives us more of a sense of ecology of spirits.
That's right.
That's, we look at it so much as if it is humans relating to everything else, but we forget that spirits themselves also have ecologies. It's not, forests do not exist just in their relationship to humans. Forests exist in relationship to themselves, to all of the things within them, to all of the myriad of beings who are relating to each other, and then also to the land around them that is not forests. These things exist, and we call that ecology now. But a wider perspective on cultural appropriation or on cultural transmission would allow us to see this all as an ecology. Again, some things spread, like the oak tree behind my house, which is sacred, is constantly dropping acorns. Some of those acorns are going to grow more trees. That is not my choice. I have nothing to do with that. That is the oak in relationship to all of the squirrels and all of the other animals that are living with it. At some point, it will grow more trees or it will not grow more trees. The only way to keep it in its place, to keep it as just one oak, would be for me to keep going and cutting down every new sprout. And to do that, if I'm doing that in order to hold to an idea of a singular oak that is unchanging, then there's some violence involved. And anyway, the oak is going to change over the winter. It's going to change over the spring. It's going to keep changing every single year. I can try to cut it back to keep it as the oak that I believe is the ideal or perfect or untainted or moral oak, but eventually you kill it. And I think we need to keep that same perspective on polytheism, on paganism, on animism, and religion in general, and especially cultures and cultural relationships across peoples. I think we could probably reduce a lot of violence that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very taken with the ecological language myself, and I mean, one of the things that we see in ecology also is that people will have a rigid notion of what is a native species to a region, and we'll see anything else as invasive. And I mean, this can come from a profoundly ecological kind of motivation, but it can end up being very similar, really, to the people who, maybe see things as pests, because they're actually trying to, because they're just interested in the productive potential of something that they see as a natural resource. And so right. There again,
if you don't mind, I'd love to talk a little bit more of that, because I did have a lot of experience attempting to try to restore some forests. When there is a invasion of so-called foreign species or invasive species or what have you, there's always something missing within that area that species is currently filling. It's filling a niche there. And where I lived in the Northwest, one of the most common plants that were considered invasive was the blackberry, the Himalayan blackberry. These would sprout up in places where the soil was extremely bad, where a lot of the plants were already dying, and where there wasn't much else covering the area. Now, these were often destructive to the entire forest as a whole because it would prevent other things from growing through it. However, if you were to go through and slash and burn all of that, all of the vines,
That's
then
right.
you are going to actually create a much greater problem, because while those blackberries were there, they were providing quite a lot of food and a lot of shelter for birds, for small rodents, etc. Those birds, those rodents were also providing food for other animals. And also they were holding the soil together. While it was there, it was a bit like a scar, I think, or a scab, something that exists there in order to protect a wound. And if you were to slash and burn the entire thing, you were just going to make everything much worse and it would never heal. And instead, what needs to be done in a situation like that is you cut back a little bit of the blackberry, and then you put some more plants there that are better for that specific context. You never remove everything at once. And you might even find you don't need to remove all of these, so-called invasives, that if the rest of the system is imbalanced, they might actually be able to maintain balance as well. Again, like with religions, with ideas, with gods, with all of that, we oftentimes have to look at the ecology of what is happening now. Why are certain people why are certain ideas that appear to be culturally appropriative or what have you occurring in certain places, particularly the United States? Well, there's a pretty clear answer for that. And it's the same reason why blackberries arrive in certain areas. The soil of belief there is quite infertile at the moment. There is not much that can really survive there because people have been not just stripped of other religious traditions, but even stripped of their ability to have engaged life with themselves and their neighbors. These things arise, they can appear like they're not supposed to be in that place, which there's lots of problems with us deciding, no, that should not be there. But we need to look at that as a sign that something has arisen to try to heal a wound. And that's a sign to us that we need to do some work to heal that wound without trying to slash and burn those things that have arisen to help heal.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's a metaphor that can really guide us. I really do think so. This to me is how we need to start thinking about these kinds of questions ecologically, and thinking about the way in which, for example, people will talk about invasive species, and often these are exactly the creatures, the plants, the animals that are the frontline relationship for people who may be living in the environments most denuded of a relationship to nature, and to bring this back to the question of the agency of the gods themselves. This is how I think we need to understand, instead of thinking of it in terms of something that humans have done, to start to think about the way in which the gods themselves have reached out, and particular gods have reached out and established these relationships with humans who are living often in the most spiritually denuded environments, you see, and really reaching out a lifeline to them, to so many of us. And I think that, I don't know how long you want to go, but we could, I think, appropriately, if you like, end on that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably a really great place, because that's something I hope is something I personally would like to work more on myself. Keeping in mind that, because there's oftentimes, you know, we tend to be very judgmental. We just do. We all do that. We're judgmental with ourselves, and we're judgmental with other people. And oftentimes, we have to have a little bit more kindness, I think, or compassion, or maybe just openness to say, okay, that's how it's happening right now, but I do not have the perspective of what that's going to become later. I don't know yet.
That's
And so, and I don't need to fix everything, and I actually don't really, I cannot fix most things. Instead, what I can do is focus on and do the work that I'm doing, deal with that, and help other people do the same thing. And yeah, I think this is a great point to end this on.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, by the way.
Yeah, I have too, and I mean, obviously, it's just the beginning. And like you say, I mean, we can't know exactly what the meaning will be of the work that we do now in future generations. All that we can do is to attempt to be custodians of these relationships here and now. And, just in the same way that we have to try to be custodians of the relationships among our fellow humans, and to try to establish an ethical disposition in those relationships as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for taking from your time and doing this live event with us. And I hope that people will check out your work, your various sites, which which will be linked to this video, and will experience more of the extraordinary work that you're doing. And so I thank you again.
Thank you again for having me.
And I thank all of our attendees and everyone else who helped to make this happen.
Thank you.
All right. Good day, everyone. Be well.
Good day.